I'm Mike Ridley and welcome to Powerboat Television. This week we're in sunny Gravenhurst, Ontario at the 34th Annual Antique and Classic Boat Show. So stay with us as we show you some great classics from the affordable to the difficult to obtain. If you get to the show early in the morning, you can enjoy the sights and sounds of the arrival of the many boats that call the Muskoka Lakes home. Before long, the docks are filled with an array of boats that date back to 1912 and cover every decade to the present. During the relative quiet prior to the official opening, I caught up with Tom Crawford, chairman of this year's show.
This is our 34th annual vintage boat show. I think it's the 20th year we've been in Gravenhurst. This year's theme is boats with stories. Every boat has a story, and there are great stories, and hopefully a lot of people are going around talking to the boat owners and hearing their stories. We have 120 boats out in the water on display. We have several on land. We've got the outboard motor group over in the Field of Dreams. We've got Paddle to Power, which is a history of boats in the Peterborough area. The Trent Severn group are here showing off the boats from canoes right up to the Peterborough 18-foot runabout. We've got Antique Boat America here doing an auction. There are 35 boats that are in the auction this year. Of course, we have our standards, the Field of Dreams. There are about 28 boats for sale in Field of Dreams. We've got the flea market. We have, of course, the Winona 2 is ours for the day. We have 4 cruises going out with Dan the Pirate, taking young people out on a cruise. There's all kinds of different things. You can make it a whole day here.
By mid-morning, Muskoka Wharf was hopping with an ever-growing number of antique and classic boat fans and the constant sound of motors as proud owners circled the bay in boats in motion. One of the high points was last year's feature boat, the Miss Canada 4. She would not start for her inaugural run last July, but was back again in all her glory. With Paddle to Power, a showcase of boats from the Kawarthas being a special feature this year, I sought out Jim Watt, a long-standing member of the Trent Severn Antique and Classic Boat Association, to chat about his classic. Jim, we're sitting in your Peterborough. Tell me about the boat, the model, its age, all that good stuff.
Okay, it's a 1959 Peterborough. It's a Lake Simcoe model. It's one of the various iterations that they did on the Hull 2112, which is the old Handy Boy. And it depends, this has got 2 more boards in height than the standard Handy Boy. It's got the longer deck and a different seat configuration.
If you were interested in acquiring a boat like this, where'd you start? Where would you go looking for a boat?
Well, you know, our website, Trent Severn Antique and Classic Boat Association of Peterborough, we have boats listed on there all the time. As a matter of fact, we had a lady contact me about 4 weeks ago, and Murray and I bought the boat this week. It's a Peterborough runabout, and it's been in their family forever. It needs to be restored, and we're going to restore it. So we pick them up, and then there's boats in there that are ready to go. You can just come in and buy one.
Another great example of boats built in the Kawarthas belongs to Prior Smith, a well-known personality in the classic boat world. Well, Prior, tell us about your Lakefield. This is a great looking boat.
This is a 1956 Lakefield Mohawk Royal Deluxe. Back in the mid-50s, this was the top of the line that came out of the Lakefield plant, which was located on Queen Street right in downtown Lakefield. Lakefield was a relatively small builder compared to Peterborough. Peterborough was the General Motors of the boat business back then. Lakefield was a much smaller operation, but they made a very good boat, very good quality boat. And this was the top of the line, 1956 Lakefield Mohawk Royal Deluxe, and it was on its way to a dump when I found it in 1986. And I had seen a boat like this when I was a kid, many years ago when I saw it. Had to do this one. Regrettably, there was virtually nothing below the splash rail. The whole front end of it was gone. So about 60 ribs later,
60 ribs.
About 60 ribs later and about 20 planks, the boat was restored back about 28 years ago. And it's had a minor touch-up about 5 years ago, but aside from that, what you see is exactly the way it was 28 years ago, when this was, believe it or not, the very first cedar strip that ever came to a Toronto ACBS show.
Well, I'm glad you brought it to a Toronto show, because you look down the dock here, the number of cedar strips that are now at the show. It's absolutely fantastic. If you get the chance, there's no better way to enjoy the show and view the over 100 antique and classic boats than by hopping aboard one and cruising the docks. In search of another story, I caught up with Jeff Mitchell, whose family has a long and interesting history in boats and racing. Jeff, tell us about this historic boat, because there's a real story in the line here.
Well, this year's boat show is obviously, every boat has a story, and we're very proud of the story that this boat particularly has. It's been in our family. My grandfather, E.A. Wilson, had the boat commissioned in 1954, and it's actually remained in the same boathouse on Keewaydin Island since that time. So it's a great honor to have that. The boat story with Miss Canada started obviously much earlier with a racing legacy that both my grandfather and my uncle Harold Wilson carried on, and we saw Miss Canada 4 run earlier today. Great to see that out on the water, but ours is truly a go slow and enjoy the scenery ride boat.
About this boat, what type of engine horsepower you got?
So this boat again is a Gravette. All the Miss Canadas were built by Gravette except for Miss Canada 1, which was a ditch burn. But this was actually built right here in Gravenhurst. It has a Chrysler Crown, Flathead 6 in it. It has just recently been rebuilt by Matt Fairbrass, and just a fabulous job. We had it out yesterday for the ACBS poker run, and she ran beautifully. She still goes slow and enjoy the scenery boat, maybe top speed of 25 miles an hour, but boy, it's the best 25 miles an hour you'll ever see.
Now, there's a lot of different Canadian boats obviously on show here in Gravenhurst, and this is a rather unique one. It's a 1935 Taylor that was built for the original Toronto Life Saving and Port Authority, later the Toronto Harbour Police, and this was restored in 2010 by Peter Moore of Barrie, Ontario. Don, this is probably one of the most different boats here at the show. You have to tell me about it.
It's a 1956 Feathercraft. Ranger 3 is the model. They made a Ranger 1, 2, and 3, and the Ranger 3 had the walk-through partition you see here. The two previous to that had this was enclosed, and a lot of the guys would have put a steering wheel here, as there was always a provision on all the boats for a steering wheel here, and the passengers would have sat here. And they always used to like racing these boats, so you could always move the steering wheel back to here and race them.
So where did it come from? What's the story that ties this into, I guess, where did you find it, and what's the connection with Canada?
Well, they were built from 1946 to 1969 in Atlanta, Georgia, as well as Welland, Ontario. And in 1969, they closed the factories. With the advent of fiberglass coming on, these boats lost their popularity, and thus they closed the factories.
Join us later in the show, because we'll have more classic boats from Muskoka. One story to top all stories belonged to this year's poster boat, the Wah-Chee-Wee, which has been absolutely stunningly restored by Clark Wooden Boats for owner John Unsworth.
I first saw the boat when I was about 12, 13 years old, and I first saw it come up to the dock. It was the first boat that I actually stepped into in Muskoka. It was at that time, it was a taxi boat called the Bee Isle, and it was owned by the Archer family that owned Browning Island, and they operated a marina. And it took us over to the first cottage we were in on Browning Island, and it was a very exciting day for me to see a boat like this, which I'd never seen before. It was one of the Rainbow boats, one of the Five Sisters, built by Ditchburn. There were duplicates of the famous Rainbow 1 boat owned by Harry Greening, and it raced in the Fisher-Allison Cup races in the 1920, 1921, and in 1923 they made this duplicate, one of the 5. About a year later, he sank the boat in Lake Muskoka because at that time they weren't really valued. Also very expensive to fix. years later, I decided that I'd have a go at raising it and restoring it. It took probably 5 or 6 years to actually find the boat because it was unclear where it had sunk. And as it turned out, it had fallen into a 100-foot bowl, and the side scan sonar skipped over the bowl, didn't see it. When we decided to restore it, we decided to restore it back to its original deck layout, and that's what you see here today.
With the crowd waiting, John fired up the Wachiwee's Ilmore V10, a modern 625 horsepower Marinized Viper engine, for what would be a highlight of my day, a ride on Lake Muskoka, and a chance to drive this historical craft. Definitely a boating experience to be cherished forever. In search of more boat stories, I spoke with Ken Lavalette of Woodwind Yachts about the beautiful Peterborough Nomads his company builds.
We build and we restore antique wooden boats, classic wooden boats. This particular boat that I'm standing beside is a brand new Peterborough Nomad replica. We started building these in 2004. And this one's brand new, just came out of the shop this morning. Most of the work at Woodwind Yachts is restoration work. About 95% of the work is restoration work. We have 6 full-time craftsmen at Woodwind Yachts, and we're very proud to say that we've restored approximately 400 boats in the 35 years that we've been in business. This is my favorite model of all the Peterborough boats that were ever built, and that's why we started building this particular model. It's just my favorite.
Now, one great last place you want to visit after touring all of the boats out on the docks is here in the Field of Dreams. If you've really enjoyed the show and the thought of owning some wood has got you excited, this is the spot to come. Now, whether you want to do a lot of work yourself with a medium-sized checkbook, or you want to have somebody else do it and start with a fairly large checkbook, you'll always find something to restore, like this 1920s Peterborough launch. Hi, I'm Mike Gridley and welcome to Powerboat Television. This week on the show, we're celebrating the 125th anniversary of the steamship Seguin with a cruise through the Muskoka Lakes with 100 of her closest friends.
While passengers streamed aboard, the crew of the HMS Seguin prepared to get underway. And just as it was 100 years ago, it's hard work stoking the boilers and managing the steam engines. With a capacity crowd of passengers, the HMS Seguin backed away from the docks in Gravenhurst, accompanied by our sister ship, the Winona II. With the early start, only about 1/2 of the expected fleet of antiques and classics surrounded the steamers. Aboard the HMS Seguin, the guests were settling in for what would be a memorable day on the water, while we caught up with the ship's officers to chat about this historic steamship.
Seguin began sailing in 1887. This is our 125th anniversary this year. Very special year for us. At that time, we were a side paddle wheeler, and we run under the name of Nipissing II. We stayed like that till 1914, just about the beginning of the First World War. And because the ship needed a lot of repairs and upgrades, they decided to keep it alongside and do those repairs until 1925. At that time, they took off the side paddle wheels, installed the twin screws and the 2 engines that operate the ship today. Because they dramatically changed the appearance of the ship, they decided to change the name, renamed it Seguin. Seguin means actually springtime in the local native language. And we sailed like that till 1958 and ran aground on Gull Rock Shoal. And then again, the long sailing career of the Seguin was interrupted for quite some time. Didn't sail again until 1981. And from 1958 until 1974, it was a floating museum alongside the dock in Gravenhurst. And in 1974, thank God we had a Prime Minister who was on our side. Prime Minister Trudeau launched the refit of the Seguin. And after $1 million and many people spending their time devoting free of charge, it came out in a ship you're sailing today in 1981.
As you tour the ship, from her engine room to the upper decks, you can really appreciate the time and talent that was invested in bringing the HMS Seguin back to life. Every aspect of the ship is beautifully redone and as historically accurate as possible.
Stay tuned, because later in the show, we'll have more on the Seguin's 125th anniversary. Welcome back to the 100-mile cruise. As the day progressed, the flotilla kept picking up boats along the route, from 1920s and 30s launches to 1950s cedar strip runabouts. By the time we were approaching the locks at Port Carling, the flotilla was reaching 100 boats and growing with each passing mile. So many woodies were in the fleet that they all had to break away from the Seguin and Winona to clear the locks ahead of their arrival. As crowds watched from shore, it took several cycles of the lock to pass all the boats in anticipation of the arrival of the Seguin. While the party at the lock grew, I met up with John Coetzee, who explained how the event was started.
This event has been about 1.5 years in the making. It was conceived about early spring 2011 when we realized it was going to be the 125th anniversary of the RMS Seguin this summer. And we wanted to, as a chapter, think about what we could do to help commemorate that event, given our chapter and ACBS's mandate is to help promote and preserve and protect the heritage of Canadian wooden boats and wooden boats in general. So we conceived this cruise, we evolved our thinking, and we thought it would be great if we could just originally have a group, maybe 10, 20 wooden boats together that would recreate the 100-mile cruise that used to be held from the 20s to the late 50s on these lakes. Then we spoke to the Muskoka Steamships people. They wanted to get the Seguin as part of the cruise, which was fantastic. And then we started promoting it through our club and through affiliate clubs in the Ontario region, and it's grown into just a huge success, where we now have not only the RMS Seguin with 99 passengers, but we've got the Winona 2, the 200-passenger larger steamship that has been added to the schedule as well. Also sold out. We have over 115 boats registered for the cruise. We are told that other wooden boats will be joining us along the way. So we are going to have probably 600 to 700 people in 115 to 150 odd boats recreating this 100-mile cruise that the Seguin and Sangamo did back in the 20s through the 50s.
After much anticipation, the Seguin arrived in Port Carling to join the party celebrating her 125th birthday and the return of the 100-mile cruise. So what was the 100-mile cruise? As the demand for steamships on the Muskoka Lakes declined in the 1920s, the idea to promote an all-day cruise on the Big Three Muskoka Lakes was born. Quickly, the role of the steamships Sangamo and Seguin evolved from essential transportation to tourism, a role proudly fulfilled by the Seguin in Winona 2 today. As the Seguin celebrates her 125 years of service on the Muskoka Lakes, she also celebrates being the oldest Royal Mail ship in the world, the oldest commercial vessel in Canada, and the 7th oldest steamship in the world. It's also fitting that over 100 antique and classic boats have joined her on this day of celebration that also raised $11,800 for the Canadian Cancer Society. As the Seguin and Winona passed through the Narrows at Port Stanfield into Lake Joseph, the number of woodies that were waiting to join the last outbound leg of the cruise was really something to see. Whether you caught the show from shore or from one of the steamships, the sight was truly wonderful for any boating enthusiast. While the crew did not stay for the return cruise, a highlight of the day was to see the steamships and their flock of boats gathered on Little Lake Joseph, where the original 100-mile cruise excursion stopped to allow passengers to disembark and explore the wilderness of Muskoka.
Well, we hope you've enjoyed this celebration of the HMS Seguin's 125 years of steaming the Muskoka Lakes. And we hope she's around for another 125 years, along with all these other great wooden classics.
sail on a dream on a crystal clear ocean, to ride on the crest of a wild raging storm, to work in the service of life and the living, in search of the answers to questions unknown, to be part of the movement, part of the growing, part of beginning to understand. I calypso the places you've been to, the things that you've shown us, the stories you tell. I calypso, I sing to your spirit, the men who have served you so long and so well. Like the dolphin who guides you, to bring us beside you, to light up the darkness and show us the way. Although we are strangers in your silent world, to live on the land we must learn from the sea. To be true as the tide, and free as a wind swell, joyful and loving in letting it be. I calypso the places you've been to, things that you've shown us, the stories you tell. I calypso, I sing to your spirit, the men who have served you so long and so well. I calypso the places you've been to, the things that you've shown us, the stories
Hi, Mike Ridley, and welcome to Powerboat Television. In the past, we've had the privilege of covering the Classic and Antique Boat Show in Gravenhurst and had a wonderful look at some beautiful restored and reproduction classic boats. This year on the show, we're going to do something a little bit different, and we're going to take a look behind the scenes to see how the boats arrive at the show in such pristine conditions. Now, behind us here is Duke's Boats. It's the last building standing of all of the old builders like Gravette and others here in Muskoka. But there's a host of other builders throughout Muskoka that are doing wonderful work with restorations and, of course, reproduction builds. So we're going to tour some of the shops and follow some projects from beginning to in the water when they're completed.
Every year, a host of shops open their doors for the Antique and Classic Boat Society Spring Tour to showcase the projects they are working on. And the projects cover restorations to every year, type, and size of antique and classic boat, as well as engines. I personally had time to stop in at Windsor Boat Works, Brackley Boats, Stan Hunter Boat Builder, Tom Adams Boat Builder, Curtis Hilbin's shop, Clark Wooden Boats, and Tim Butson Wooden Boat Builder. While at Clark Wooden Boats, two boats caught my eye for projects to follow over the next few months. This hydroplane, just undergoing a major restoration, and this ditch burn showing some extensive hull and other work. To balance these restorations with a new reproduction build, a significant area for several shops, Tim Butson agreed to have us follow one of his projects. On my first visit back to Muskoka, Gary talked about two boats we would focus on.
This is a boat that's been around Muskoka its whole life. It was built in Bracebridge by Manette Shields. It sat in a local marina for years, and lots of people knew about it, but they never wanted to sell it. Their idea was always to restore it.
The other boat we wanted to have a look at, that's going in the water again this summer after it's completed, or is
yes,
it
is.
So tell me about that one.
This boat's a 1931 ditch burn, so built here in Gravenhurst. This is its second owner. It's the first time that this boat has been out of the boathouse that it went to when it was built.
Wow, now that's long history. How in-depth is the work here?
Being pointed at both ends the way this boat is, it had been squared out at the back to give it more stability. The current owner wants to go back to something that's more original. So we've had to come up with the hull shape and design to put that back to original.
That's a lot of work.
Our next stop was to check in at Tim Butson's shop to see his new build that was underway.
We're a traditional builder, so all our construction is very traditionally. We don't do any plywoods or epoxies. Everything is solid mahoganies, double plank bottoms like they used to do, and copper rivets. The boats are traditionally designed the way my dad was taught from his dad, with using half models and scaling everything up to full-size drawings and then creating the actual boat from the drawings.
Later in the show, we'll check back in on the progress of these boats.
Well, it's been a few weeks since we've been to Gary Clark Wooden Boats to check on the progress of the ditch burn and the Ventnor design hydroplane. So let's go in the shop and have a look.
The progress made on Lake Long, which means eagle, was impressive. The Spanish cedar planks in the hull literally glowed under the coats of varnish. The research, attention to detail, and skill involved in replicating the original hull design using traditional materials was impressive. With hull work complete and all of the chrome refinished and installed, the crew spent the next several weeks installing the engine, electrical, and other systems. By late summer, she'd been in the water for trial runs a few times to ensure she was perfect. From May through October, work on the Minette Shields-built Ventnor hydroplane progressed steadily. Witnessing the progress, one begins to appreciate the time, knowledge, and talent required to restore these antiques and classics. Each frame and plank takes hours to fabricate, shape, and install. After countless hours of fabrication, many more go into sanding and finishing. In order to get the boat into the water this season, a bulletproof Mercruiser 5.7-liter V8 was installed, while the original gray marine racing engine was sent off to Tennessee for a complete rebuild. Each trip to Muskoka also saw us dropping in at Tim Butson's in Bracebridge to follow the progress on the Gentleman's Racer. Tim and his team are truly traditional builders, and the time it takes to handcraft a boat like this is literally thousands of hours. While many shops employ power planers and sanders, at Butson's, the hulls are hand-planed, a slow, painstaking process. Over several months, they would drive in thousands of screws and make and glue in the equivalent number of plugs. Each phase of the boat's construction was inspected and approved by the owner, including seat design and positioning, and windshield height and more, making this a truly custom boat, but also causing some delays in the progress of the build. Unfortunately, the boat was just being stained and varnished as the snow came to Muskoka, so she won't have her sea trials until the spring.
It's really been interesting following the progress of this wonderful Ventnor design built by Minette Shields. First saw it in March during the spring tour, and we've been following the course of its construction over the summer. When we come back later on in the show, we're going to see this running on the waters of Lake Muskoka. Well, it's certainly been worth the wait. We first saw this Ventnor design built by Minette Shields here in Muskoka back in Gary's shop in March on the spring tour, and we followed it through with the rebuild. It's a gorgeous restoration of this late 1930s hydroplane racer. It's going to be a gorgeous sight that you're going to see for years to come here on the Muskoka Lakes.
And gorgeous she is. While the owner had elected to finish the boat in natural wood with minimal chrome, unlike most race boats, this hydroplane will still turn heads. With the modern Mercruiser, the Ventnor had plenty of power and accelerated smartly. But being the second outing on the lake and a customer's boat, Gary was not out to push it to test its limits. It was just an honor to be on the water in the classic hydroplane with the unknown past. With the press of the starter button, the calm of the fall morning was broken. Giving the engine time to warm up in the 9 degrees Celsius heat wave, Gary idled out and around Gravenhurst Bay as we chatted about the Ditchburn.
Over time, people change things when it's easier, and this boat was repowered from a 6-cylinder engine to a V8 engine, and the hull was modified to support that extra power, and we put it back to its original configuration, and even though it has more power, it still seems to perform well.
With plenty of power, we are up and running in no time. With its original 6-cylinder scripts, top speed was in the high 30s, but with a modern Mercruiser V8, L'Aiglon now tops 50 miles per hour. In smooth waters, the ride is soft, slightly bow high, and an exhilarating experience. Given the months spent following the restoration of these craft, our time with them on the water was all too short.
Well, it's great to finally see this Ditchburn back out on the water. It's been a long project. Gary and his crew at Clark Wooden Boats started the project last fall, and we've been with it since March. But here we are, it's October, on the waters in Muskoka, enjoying a beautifully restored boat. But the cycle starts again. This winter, more boats will go into the restoration shops around Muskoka to come back out in the spring looking like this.